Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, 4/20/17. And it's not quite 4:20 as I'm speaking to you. But in Golden Gate Park today, people will be sparking up and celebrating their right to use marijuana as adults. But I want to open the podcast today by demanding free speech rights for one of the most offensive people in the United States today, from my perspective. Ann Coulter is a provocateur. She will say anything to sell books. She will wear short skirts to promote her Christian values. She is a hypocritical asshole. Pardon my language. But the University of California, Berkeley, citing concerns that violence might erupt if this bimbo is allowed to speak on campus. They have canceled a speech for the Young Republicans group that was scheduled for a week from today, April 27th. And I object. I support Mario Savio and the legacy of the free speech movement at Berkeley, which was started in opposition to racism, the Vietnam War, the governorship of Ronald Reagan, many other issues. But free speech is free speech. And just as Milo Yiannopoulos should have been permitted to speak at Berkeley, a month ago, making a victim and a martyr out of Ann Coulter doesn't serve anybody's interests. And she's saying that she's coming to Berkeley and she's going to speak somewhere next Thursday. And I support her right to do so. And I think that the campus officials and the city of Berkeley are making a huge mistake. Now, this is partly because this past Saturday, as we have covered, there were skirmishes on the streets of Berkeley. And this was provoked by a group of Trump supporters who intentionally came to poke eyes in the People's Republic of Berkeley, the leftiest of the leftiest communities in the United States, at least by reputation. There are quite a few conservative people who actually live in Berkeley. I know some. But that's the perception. And inevitably, a handful of goons, black bloc anarchist types, self-styled anti-fascists, put on their hoods, grabbed sticks and garbage pails and whatever else was available, and they got into fistfights and conflicts with the pro-Trump demonstrators. There were about 24 arrests. A handful of them were from way out of town. They came to Berkeley particularly to provoke violence. And so I don't regard that as the kind of riot or, extreme event that requires the campus to lock down free speech, even as odious as Ann Coulter is. And we know she's going to intentionally provoke people. I tried to interview her one time. I started to read one of her books, and it was just so banal, so juvenile. She's a name caller, and she will equate liberalism with treason. Now, despite the way I dismiss her views, I still say she should be able to express them. And I hope that the leaders of the campus will reconsider. Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview that I'm very proud of. David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times reporter, who opened his mailbox about 3 weeks ago, and there were 2 pages, 2005 1040 forms for Donald J. and Melania Trump. As you know, he took that find to the Rachel Maddow show, where she proceeded to hype and tease it in a way that I think undermined her credibility, but not so much David's. And we talk about that episode. And he, is kind of polite about Rachel Maddow, saying, hey, it's her show, this is how she does it. But I think on that program, Johnston comported himself very well. He didn't link himself to the speculative narrative that Rachel Maddow used in the opening segment of her program before she brought Johnston out with the 2 pages of tax documents. David K. Johnston has been investigating Donald Trump for about 25 years. Last summer, he published a book about Trump called The Making of Donald Trump. I recommend it to you. And listen to this excerpt, because first he excoriates Sean Spicer, White House press secretary, and then he unloads on Donald Trump.
Sean Spicer never had the good manners to respond to me, even though I emailed him twice. And secondly, he took my document and he gave it to my competition. Mm-hmm. That is the absolute single most unethical thing that anyone who's in the publicity business, and that's what Sean Spicer is the mouthpiece for the president. He is in the publicity business. That is the most unethical thing you can do. And it's revealing of the fact that Donald Trump, his boss, has no moral scruples of any kind. This is a man, who was involved up to his eyeballs with a major drug trafficker, who put the life of a sickly infant, his grandnephew, in jeopardy over money, and who has swindled investors, cheated small businesses, and refused to pay workers for his entire life. He is a man with no moral scruples at all, period. Stop.
That's David K. Johnston from our new in-depth interview, available to subscribers today at peterbcollins.com. Donald J. Trump has no moral scruples of any kind, period. Stop. And Johnston knows what he's talking about. In our in-depth conversation, he talks about the potential for tax cheating that might be exposed if Trump releases full tax returns going back for years. We also go through almost line by line the tax return, and I'm going to link to a copy of it, so when you listen to the interview with Johnston, you can see as we go down the form and talk about some of the entries. And I'm proud to say that Johnston says he's given dozens of interviews since he got these tax returns, and mine was, he said, the only one that went into this level of detail. So I encourage you to listen, and I think you'll find it quite informative. Meanwhile, the Internal Revenue Service, before I get to this, I got to tell you, at the end of the interview, Johnston affirms what I said in my Tax Day Manifesto. Number one, that it is ridiculous for most taxpayers to have to slave over these forms and file them with the IRS because the frickin' IRS already has the information that you're writing down on that form and sending in to them. They could just as easily have a computer generate a tax bill and send it to you. And Johnston really responded when I complained about the tax form that Obamacare users have to fill out. He said, yeah, I tried to help my daughter with that, and it was just so frustrating, I walked away. And he agreed with me that it's a form of punishment for those of us who receive Obamacare subsidies. All right, on to the IRS. This is really bizarre because in a little-noticed clause in a 2015 highway funding bill, the Republicans buried a clause that orders the Internal Revenue Service to outsource collection of delinquent debt of amounts under $50,000. So consider this. If you owe the IRS more than $50,000, you've probably got an attorney, you're a white-collar person with a higher income. They're not going to send the goons to interrupt your dinner or knock on your door. But the little people, the ones who are overburdened by low incomes and higher taxes, the people who've run up some sort of a balance at the IRS and are having a hell of a time paying it off because, well, gosh, they've got to pay escalating rent and utilities and all the other costs of living. But the IRS has signed up 3 companies, Pioneer Credit Recovery, which has a terrible record, and 2 others who will be able to, they'll be authorized to work the lists of uncollected taxes from the IRS, and they'll get paid a commission to hound you and get you to pay it. Now, this company, Pioneer Credit Recovery, a subsidiary of Navient, was effectively fired 2 years ago by the Department of Education because of unacceptably high rates of misleading the debtors about their loans. This is also going to enable a cottage industry of fraudulent bounty hunters, and would-be tax collectors, because up until now, at least for the last few years, the IRS has been able to tell you if somebody calls you and says they're from the IRS, they're not, because we contact taxpayers first by mail. This will no longer be the case. And so we can imagine the boiler rooms offshore will be working on their American accents to call up and say, "Hi, I'm Bob, and I'm here to collect money from the IRS." I mean, already I get robocalls like that. I just ignore them. You've probably received them too. But the IRS is trying to collect a backlog of $138 billion. And so they're going to unleash these debt collection agencies to chase the money down. And what's so insidious is that the plan is to turn over 140,000 accounts, all with a balance of 50 grand or less. That's who they're targeting, friends. Oh, it's insidious. It truly is. Over the past few years, I've had several great interviews with journalist Trevor Aronson. Most recently, I think last summer sometime. Go to the search window at peterbcollins.com to dig them up. But he's now writing for The Intercept, and I'm only a little peeved here because I can't manage to read everything that was posted today in a very ambitious mega series called Trial and Terror. Trevor Aronson, in 4 parts, and the first one runs 20-plus pages when I printed it out, he talks about an issue that I care a whole lot about, the framing by the FBI of alleged domestic terrorism suspects, most of whom have been convicted despite the fact that they never really committed an actual crime or crossed the line into violent behavior. Over 800 people, well, almost 800 people, it's just under 800, have been prosecuted for so-called domestic terrorism since 2001. Most of them, as Aronson writes, never even got close to committing an act of violence. And some of them are now so far into the system that they're being released from prison. And he says the release of people convicted of terrorism-related charges with little, if any, monitoring by law enforcement might suggest U.S. government officials believe they can be fully rehabilitated following minor prison terms. A more likely explanation is that many of these so-called terrorists weren't particularly dangerous in the first place. And Aronson goes on to cite case after case after case of people, mostly Muslim Americans, who encountered a paid FBI informant, maybe at a mosque or a community center, who then engaged them in talk about jihad, got them to watch jihadi videos, suggested crimes, provided the means, sometimes providing cash. And then when they get ready to punch that cell phone or trigger something or actually commit a crime that they were put up to, the cameras roll, the goons swoop in, and we are told that once again we have been protected from a dangerous act of terrorism. It's bullshit, and that level, that is offensive in its own right. But this is a serious corruption of our constitutional system. Our criminal justice system is overruled by an agency like the FBI that runs roughshod over our constitutional rights and the laws that are on the books in this country. And they get away with it time and time again. Perhaps in some cases because they've got dirt on the political leaders who would otherwise change the laws or provide real active oversight of the FBI as congressional committees are supposed to do. When I have time, I'll read the entire series, and I'll see if I can get Trevor back for an interview in the near future to talk about it. Well, Bill O'Reilly is going to walk away from Fox News with only $25 million. Fox renegotiated his contract and extended it earlier this year, but they put in some clauses, essentially saying that if he got fired for cause, and this is cause, then they'd only have to pay him the equivalent of 1 year's salary. O'Reilly, pictured in the Vatican shaking hands with the Pope. I mean, consider the optics here. He's on vacation. He gets fired. It's all over the news in the United States. Now, where do you find O'Reilly? He's in Vatican City, chumming with the Pope. And if you haven't seen Stephen Colbert, he actually resurrected his character from Comedy Central that was inspired by Bill O'Reilly on his CBS show last night. And Colbert, the old Colbert, defended, of course, Bill O'Reilly. So now we're seeing that the total cost of Fox News, of Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly, is at least $85 million. And a lot of people are saying, well, you know, this is great because it was activists who put pressure on corporate advertisers that forced the hand of the Murdoch family. That's partly true. There's an interesting think piece at the New York Times today written by Bruce Headlam. And he argues that actually the drop in the stock price is probably what got Sir Keith Rupert Murdoch's attention more than issues of advertiser boycotts. But Headlam notes that boycotts have been working. The North Carolina legislature was forced to partly reverse its ugly bill about transgender bathrooms in order to win back NCAA tournaments. I think the NCAA caved too soon. They also note that a campaign by the group Sleeping Giants has shamed hundreds of marketers into pulling their ads from Breitbart News. And there are other boycotts that have been successful. Cracker Barrel back in 1991, the the Girl Scouts of America going all the way back to the 1970s. And he argues that the main impact of these boycotts is on the stock price. And that's why these people, decision makers, will ultimately make a decision to fire a Bill O'Reilly. But I find this celebration of boycotts a little bit unsettling because my right to boycott the immoral and unjust actions of the State of Israel through boycott, divestments, and sanction, well, that's not all right. Governor Cuomo in New York passed an executive order. California legislature passed a law that punishes people who use their free speech rights to say, I won't do business with Israel until they change their policies about the occupation and the treatment of the Palestinians. And this comes into focus because the hunger strike has now spread to 1,100 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And the leader, 57-year-old Marwan Barghouti, is getting a lot of attention. There's speculation, I'm looking at a piece from Vice News here today, that he is using this to raise his profile because recent polls of Palestinian voters show that if he weren't in prison and he ran against Mahmoud Abbas or the leader of Hamas, that he would beat either one of them. Now, there is a substantial stipulation there that he is behind bars on 5 life sentences imposed by the Israelis, claiming that his role in the Second Intifada made him guilty of murder. He did not collaborate or participate in that trial. He protested it, and so it's not really a clear conviction in terms that you and I would see as legitimate. So the polls show that if he ran against Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, that he would win overwhelmingly. Now, the Israelis have released prominent Palestinians from prison and commuted their sentences in the past. But it's very hard for me to imagine the Netanyahu government taking a step like that, or the Trump, team, including Jared Kushner, being able to find leverage and the desire to pressure the Israelis to allow Barghouti out of prison so that he could lead the Palestinians. Now, there are moderate Israelis. I found one quote here. Moshe Raz, the Secretary General of the left-wing Meretz Party in Israel, told Vice that he'd be willing to work with Barghouti. Quote, although I'm aware of his violent past, I believe that Barghouti could make peace with Israel. I can say that because I know him personally. And I've learned that President Abbas will be meeting with Donald Trump on May 3rd. So these are interesting developments, and we will continue to follow them. In Venezuela, the streets of Caracas are once again filled with protesters, and it's anybody's guess how organic these protests are and to what extent the covert operations of the U.S. continue to bring down the socialist government that was started by Hugo Chavez and now led by Maduro. And yesterday, the government of Nicolas Maduro took possession. They nationalized, at least temporarily, a General Motors assembly plant in a city on the central coast in the state of Carabobo. Now, there's a little history here because union activists who are loyal to Maduro shut the plant down for the last 42 days. And General Motors asked the government to help the company retake control from the union activists. And then the government said, well, we'll just take over the facility ourselves. And a representative of General Motors in Venezuela, Enrique Tajan, said, well, in other words, we are twice out of control of our plant. Now, one of the other factors here is there's almost zero demand for new cars in Venezuela because the economy is just, it's decimated. Nobody has the money to buy a new car. Businesses in general aren't operating. 5 years ago, automakers across all different companies made about 100,000 cars and trucks in Venezuela. Last year, the number was 3,200. So there's not much to be nationalized there, and a lot of American flag companies have come up with some economic maneuvers to write down their losses without technically leaving the business sphere there in Venezuela. So we will have to watch and see where all that leads us. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Brian Wilcuts and Joe Clarici, Brian Mazzi, and also I want to thank Morgan Weiser for a new annual subscription. I really appreciate the support that I get from my listeners across the globe, and I'd like to invite you to join in if you haven't already. You can get a subscription in less than 3 minutes. You come to peterbcollins.com, click menu, pull it down, click Become a Subscriber. Takes you to the sign-up page. The options are laid out for you there, $5, $10, $20 a month, or a $50 annual subscription. You can go to the Apple App Store and buy our app that works on iPhones and iPads. Spreaker supports Android phones. So there are a lot of different ways you can get the show, many ways you can support our efforts, and I hope you will do so. Well, we got the details of the amount of money that was raised from fat cats and corporate interests for the Trump inaugural back in January. And, of course, it was lightly attended. Just don't tell Donald that. But what's interesting is the last Obama inauguration cost about $50 million, and Obama relaxed his rules, did take some corporate money there. I'm not terribly happy about that. But this was all corporate, all 1% money. And Trump raised double the amount of Obama. It's $107 million. Now, what the hell did they spend it on? The only musical acts that anybody recognized who performed at the inaugural balls were country star Toby Keith and the over-the-hill rock band Three Doors Down. Did they pay them each $30 million to perform? Well, and look at this. Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate and the guy who is a real connection to Israel here in the United States, he gave $5 million. That's not all. Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, who was at the White House yesterday, he kicked in, at least $1 million. Stephen Cohen, Charles Schwab. I think this is the Cohen who is an advisor to Trump, Charles Schwab of the Schwab investment firm based here in California, and Robert Parsons, the founder of GoDaddy.com. A few years back, I tried doing a little advertising on the podcast for GoDaddy, and a lot of people properly corrected me and said, you know, Peter, GoDaddy may be a decent internet service support company, but its ownership stinks. And this is further evidence of that. A couple of lawsuits that I think are interesting. The Cherokee Nation is suing the distributors and retailers of opioid drugs, and they're suing them in tribal court, which means that the process will be faster, probably more favorable to the tribes, and that their ability to subpoena and use discovery to get information will probably be enhanced as compared to actions in federal court. But the suit alleges that the companies violated Cherokee laws by failing to prevent the diversion of pain pills to the black market, profiting from the growing opioid epidemic, and decimating communities across the 14 counties in Oklahoma, I think? I think that's right. Yes, Oklahoma. So understand the term nation applies to the Cherokee Nation, which has reservations in 14 counties, as defined by the state of Oklahoma. The lawsuit says the defendants turned a blind eye to the problem of opioid diversion and profited from the sale of prescription opioids to the citizens of the Cherokee Nation in quantities that far exceeded the number of prescriptions that could reasonably have been used for legitimate medical purposes. So they were peddling this hillbilly heroin to Native Americans. This is like the fire water that was introduced back in the 19th century. So the big three drug distributors are McKesson Corporation, based here in San Francisco, Cardinal Health, and Amerisource Bergen. They control 85% of prescription drug distribution in this country. And in addition to this Native American lawsuit, last month, 7 counties in West Virginia, which has the highest prescription drug overdose rate in the nation, filed suits against many of the same corporations. And I think this is very important because the profiteering of these amoral drug companies to just peddle these addictive, powerful drugs. And I don't deplore the people who use them for good reasons. Chronic pain is a very serious issue, and you should be able to get the medications you need. But the marketing of OxyContin and its related drugs has led to a huge wave of profits for these companies. And they don't give a shit about the human cost, about the individual lives, the families, and the communities that are destroyed. And we know that when people get cut off from the prescription pills, they are so addicted that they move to street heroin. And we have a heroin crisis with the introduction of fentanyl as a substitute, which is far more powerful and deadly. And so we're seeing a lot of people, mostly white people, become a part of this pattern of addiction and destruction. And the suits who made money off it, they have not been held accountable. Here's the other lawsuit that tickled me today. And this is karma, baby. Ain't it a bitch? Because I referenced yesterday that we saw the first case of a so-called dreamer. Someone is here without documents who came as a child and who was extended the deferred action from deportation by the Obama administration. And the first case of a deportee is 23-year-old Juan Manuel Montes. He was living in California. He came here at the age of 9, and he has been deported to Mexico. So, representatives have sued on his behalf, and the case has been placed with Judge Gonzalo Curiel. Now, scratch your head. Can you remember who Judge Gonzalo Curiel is? The guy who was slimed as a Mexican judge by Donald Trump when he presided over the Trump University fraud case? Well, Judge Curiel maintained his dignity in that episode, and I don't know exactly why he was assigned this case. It's typically done on a random basis. But I think it is perfect justice so far. In New York City, Mayor de Blasio, who's facing re-election, has announced his support for a series of initiatives to jack up the price of a pack of cigarettes. Now, I'm told in New York it's currently about $10.50 a pack. And he wants to increase the taxes to raise that to $13. Now, let me be honest. Here in California, we have jacked up the tobacco taxes. It's now just under $8, I think, for a pack of Winston's or Marlboros. I don't smoke that stuff, so I don't really know. But I see it at the supermarket and the drugstore. And at what point does the sin tax move from becoming proportional and justifiable? Because after all, smoking cigarettes kills people. It produces a huge cost to our medical infrastructure. And I don't object to pricing cigarettes to recover the true cost of the damage that occurs. But at what point does it just become punitive? Because smokers are now a sharp and bedeviled minority. It's a legal product. We're not outlawing it. It's not a crime to smoke a cigarette. But it's now a class-based habit. It's pretty hard for somebody who only makes $13 an hour to spend $13 on a pack of cigarettes. And I just want some fairness in this. And the other thing I should tell you is that when Rob Reiner, the actor, led a ballot measure that raised the tobacco tax here in California, it produced the first 5 agencies that spent that money on early childhood education and development. And I was a beneficiary of that because I produced a couple of radio shows for 10 years that were funded by the agencies that get the money from the tobacco tax. And I thought long and hard about this, and I said, well, this is a good way of taking this sin tax money and investing in healthy futures. And the evidence is in. There's a new study, as reported by the New York Times, that high-quality child care has the biggest economic payoff for parents and their children, even their grandchildren. It has the biggest positive effect on women's employment and pay. It's especially helpful for low-income families because it can propel generations of children toward increased earnings, better jobs, improved health, more education, and decreased criminal activity. In other words, it's a hell of a good investment. For example, the program that was studied cost a lot. The child care services were $18,000 per year per student. But even at that rate, the researchers showed that the investment returned over $7 for every dollar spent, and that the greatest measurable impact, the positive impact, was on boys. And when you look at our prisons, you look at who drops out of high school, you look at the failed lives in the United States, many of them are males. Many of them are males who were not afforded a good childhood. So I think that's really telling. And I do support the use of the tobacco tax up to a point to try to produce healthy outcomes for non-smokers as well as those who have the habit. A lot of people are chortling about this satellite image that was released showing a North Korean nuclear facility and the speculation that a group of people were on this paved area outdoors playing volleyball last Sunday morning. Now, I find this curious in a number of ways because I don't understand why this image has been released. We were all on, war footing, the rumors, the threats, the bluffing from the Trump administration, the non-existent carrier fleet off the North Korean coast, the concern that Kim Jong-un was going to launch a missile and a nuclear test over this past weekend to honor his grandfather's 105th birthday. Well, he did try to launch a missile, but apparently the Korean version of Stuxnet that the U.S. has managed to infiltrate into the Korean military complex produced another fizzled rocket launch. But there is no indication that the North Koreans made any effort for a nuclear weapons test last weekend. despite all of the Western speculation and the threats based on that speculation. And so I really have to ask, who decided that this image would advance somebody's interests at this particular point in time? And, you know, the speculation is, here's a guy quoted. His name is Joe Bermudez. He's an expert at 38 North, a website that got a hold of this image and released it. He said, well, it suggests that the facility might be going into a standby mode. It also suggests that these volleyball games are being conducted with the North Koreans knowing that we will be looking and reporting on it. They are either sending us a message that they have put the facility on standby, or they are trying to deceive us. Maybe they're trying to flip us the bird, because they know that identified facilities are constantly monitored by American satellites, that nothing that they do out in broad daylight is secret. Now, we may not know where all of their nuclear facilities are located, but in this case, it appears that we know and that they know we know, and so they could be messing with us. But the bigger question is, if we can see a satellite image of a North Korean nuclear facility and dudes playing volleyball, why can't we see the U.S. satellite imagery from the shoot-down of MH17 over Ukraine a few years ago? Why can't we see the satellite imagery that the White House claims supports its slam dunk opinion that the Syrian government was responsible for the gas incident, the nerve agent release in Khan Shaykhun a couple of weeks ago? So I don't expect you to have an answer to those questions, but that's why I asked them. And our government, I think, owes us an explanation. And finally today, I want to salute Bruce Springsteen, because he has just released with his friend Joe Grishecki a song that is an anti-Trump anthem. It's called That's What Makes Us Great. And I haven't heard it yet. I've just seen a news article about it. Here's some of the lyrics. Don't tell me a lie and sell it as a fact. I've been down that road before and I ain't going back. Don't you brag to me that you never read a book. I never put my faith in a con man and his crooks. Now, this to me is a signal development, because all through the Obama years, I didn't receive any songs that were political in nature, satirical in tone. And during the Bush administration, they came in at the rate like, 2 or 3 a week, some weeks. And so I hope that this is part of the reactivation of protest, the reactivation of the left in this country, and that this is just the first of many anti-Trump songs to be released. Thanks for joining me for my News and Comment podcast. It's available every day on YouTube. Take a look. You'll find it there. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.